Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Podcast Summit here on YouTube. I'm Greg Javer, and this is Summit number 6. So we just started doing this earlier this year, me and a few associates and friends of mine, including Joe Blevins, who has joined me for the 3rd time here at the Podcast Summit. And this time, finally, belatedly, getting around, and it was me dragging feet. Joe's been ready to do this for a while now, but if you'll remember in the last podcast summit that we did together, we reviewed What's the Difference, Ed Wood's paperback from 1967, What's the Difference, which there was a sequel to, What's After. So today we're going to talk about What's After and see what we think about that one. So anything you want to say as an opener, Joe?
I am very excited to cover this novel. We've chosen, just by pure happenstance, a time when our nation is actually going through a lot of racial protests. This novel kind of shows what America was going through in 1966 and 67. And you really can see from it that we're kind of in the same place today. A lot of things have really not changed. So I'm interested to see what you thought of this book.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And you're right. It was pure happenstance because when we talked about it initially, we thought, let's do I think perhaps I suggested the Watts pair. And
Right.
Unbeknownst to me, well, not unbeknownst to me because I know what's happening in the world around me, but I really didn't connect the dots. And we never explicitly mentioned that in the first podcast summit that we did. That, yeah, we're very well aware that this, 50 plus years on, is still a very relevant topic, generally speaking. The larger topic, of course, the racial elements that are inherent in the book, as well as the urban decay, civil strife, et cetera, unfortunately, still persists. Yeah. So real quick, I'll backtrack and. No need really, I feel, to you can check out What's the Difference podcast. You want to learn more about that. No need to really go back into that because What's After manages, I think, quite effectively to set itself largely aside, and it works as a completely standalone book entirely on its own. So to backtrack, though, super quick summary. The main character in What's the Difference was Rocky Alley, a black kid who grew up in Watts and ultimately ended up getting involved with a little bit of a shadowy sort of political organization, and it culminates with him participating in the Watts Uprising from 1965, the Watts Riots, where we pick and the main character there is, of course, Rocky Alley, and as well as his girlfriend, I guess.
Yeah.
Increasingly so.
As the novel goes along, yeah.
Right. His girlfriend, Angie, aka her real name, Ruth Cooper, who was, raised in the Deep South and made her way to Hollywood. And she also gets into the television and film industry, as does Rocky. We get a hint of that at the end of What's the Difference, but we pick things up 1 year later, roughly 1 year later, in What's After, and now Rocky is the one of the protagonists on a TV show called the Tucson Kid, and he's not the main protagonist, but in a way, he kind of is. As we get deeper into the book, we see that the crew certainly favors him to a degree, and Angie, his girlfriend, she also has a recurring series, or a recurring role in the series. So that's where we start things off with What's After. So what do you think, Joe? Anything you wanted to mention early on in the book? That's where we pick things up a year later.
Well, of course, Rocky got the job because of his heroics, sort of during the Watts riots. He attempts to save and then doesn't save a girl named Mala Smith that he'd been romantically involved with, and Mala is mentioned very fleetingly in this book.
Yeah.
One thing I thought was this book is supposed to be taking place, I think, in 66 or 67. The kind of a Western series that the Tucson Kid, which is also sometimes called Gun Law.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just called the Tucson Kid. Now, the Tucson Kid sounds like a title from like 1952 or something.
Wow.
At least Gun Law, which is another alternate title for this show, at least sounds like something that could have been on TV in the 1960s because it sounds like Gunsmoke.
Right.
And either way, you see that Ed Wood had this abiding interest in Westerns, and he tried to get he writes about Westerns in his stories more often than you'd guess, and he'll have characters be Western actors. So even though the Watts riots and Westerns really don't have anything to do with each other, he tries to get the Western thing in here. And you're right that the crew does favor Rocky over his co-star, I think Larry Hill is the name of the
Larry
guy.
Hill, yeah.
And we in fact get a nice little scene in which Rocky is able to devise the blocking
Yeah.
on an action scene, and that's kind of interesting. So it's an in so many ways, this is another coincidence. So much of this reminds me of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It really feels like it
Wow.
could be an adjunct to that almost,
I never
because
I never really thought of that. That's brilliant. I get, yeah, the analogy really does work, absolutely. And
yeah,
going back to the Tucson Kid, yeah, gun law. So the first time it's mentioned the Tucson Kid, and then gun law is mentioned, and it's mentioned as the Tucson Kid, and then gun law again a little bit later. And it was a
yeah,
little unclear to me. What I could ascertain was that Rocky refers to individual episodes as quote unquote segments throughout the book, and I think gun law was a segment of the Tucson Kid television show.
okay,
Could have gotten that a little wrong. I don't know, but
maybe,
but 1950, I think you said 52. I think it was 52 or 53. Crossroad Avenger, The Adventures of the Tucson Kid, was a
right,
pilot that Ed Wood shot. So he's clearly, inside joke, so to speak. He's clearly referencing his own past here. That particular
yeah,
pilot was an unsold pilot that never came to fruition. It still exists today, and you can check it out, Crossroad Avenger.
yeah. I've
It
reviewed
stars
it.
it stars Tom Keene, and Tom Keene is actually mentioned obliquely here in the book for apropos of nothing really,
Nothing.
other than to
It's
mention him. Yeah,
yeah. Ed goes on a roll call of the stars of the past, and
right.
he mentions Tom King. Well, this is also very coincidental because I've been researching another pilot that Ed did with Tom Keene, and I'm probably going to write about that hopefully sometime soon. Um, and again, I think Ed was tied into this. The thing that kept the Crossroad Avenger or the other series, Tom Keene, U.S. Marshal, from selling is that they were kind of out of step with the times. By the
Yeah,
1950s, Westerns were already maybe becoming a little bit more sophisticated on television. We were starting to get by the end of the 50s, the adult Westerns. And certainly by the end of the 60s, when this novel is taking place, this television show that he's making would be ridiculously out of date. But who knows? And then there's a debate going on in the novel as to who's actually watching the Tucson Kid,
right.
and there's no agreement on that. Um, I would have to guess that it could be kids that are watching it, because maybe kids are less critical of the entertainment that they take in, and they're more likely to just accept whatever they see. And it could be older people who are nostalgic for the old kind of Westerns. So um, I don't know who this television show was intended for. It would have been very odd seeing it on TV in 1967.
For sure. I mean, by then you've got more commonly the Western shows that were on television would have been things like Wagon Train and Bonanza, which would have been more orthodox sort of television series with a fuller cast of characters and real narrative driven. This
Right.
does harken back to just a quick, almost sort of serial like sort of snapshot of a little quick action Western is what the sense you get, because
Yeah.
we don't spend a whole heck of a lot of time talking about the Tucson Kid nor on the set.
No.
But it is a little murky later on in the book as to what the size of the audience is, and certainly there are those who are convinced that Rocky is their guy because he has a
Yeah.
massive audience that he's speaking to, and certainly we see you mentioned he gets to block a scene out, a very elaborate scene as he describes it in the saloon with like
Yeah.
100+ extras, which quite frankly for a low budget television series of this sort at the time or a little earlier, just it simply would never have happened.
Right.
Mm,
But I think it kind of speaks to the kind of production that Ed wanted to be involved in.
right,
I think this is a little bit of
exactly.
the kind of show Ed would have wanted to do.
Yeah, that's how I took it as well. So, so early on in the book, though, it takes a little. We learn, a few details along the way, but quite early on in the book, I think Angie sort of assumes the central role almost as the main protagonist for the first 5 or 6 chapters, and
Yeah.
what we get in early on in chapter 1 is the narrative setup, right? Two gentlemen from Rocky's past
Past.
have approached him, and they finger him to get back involved with the quote unquote organization. We'll get more into what that that really
Right.
means. It takes literally the whole entire paperback for just that one element to play out. It is the sole narrative element really in the
Yeah.
whole entire book. So Ed manages to, in between, spend a lot of time uh, meandering around his sort of obsessions, his own personal themes and motifs. And I don't mean meandering actually in a pejorative way, because I enjoy that he takes so much time to sort of, if you like Ed Wood, or if you're a casual fan of Ed Wood, you might find this a bit trying or a bit boring. If you really like Ed Wood, I think you'll find a lot here to chew on. I'm getting a little ahead of my conclusion,
Yeah.
but I found it to touch back on What's the Difference really quickly. When we talked about What's the Difference, we talked about how you'd have to catch yourself periodically throughout it as you were reading it. And
Right.
you're kind of like, where am I? Who is this character? What are they remembering? When did this take place? How does this fit into the larger narrative? Not whatsoever the case with What's After.
No.
It is an incredibly easy to grasp, straightforward narrative, and frankly a breezy read, if that makes sense. I mean, you can just
Yeah.
blow right through it without having to think twice about it. So go ahead, Joe. I'll
Yeah.
leave it there. I
More.
was going to conclude
No.
more, and I don't want to do that yet. Yeah.
No, more so than much more so than the first novel. The first novel I've said is a series of dreams and flashbacks. Sometimes the characters aren't even awake,
Right.
um, and it's both Rocky's point of view and Angie's point of view as they're dreaming and flashing back to certain things, and we jump around in time. And I think Ed might have been a little more coherent or sober maybe when he was writing What's After. Almost the first half of the novel is really, as you said, is a lot about Angie, and she basically goes on a sexual field trip from one partner to another. She has this committed relationship with Rocky going, but she has, I think, 3 other or maybe 4 other different partners.
There's
She there's the Sonny
Sonny Jones, the assistant director on
director,
the Tucson Kid.
and then Rance, the
Georgie.
yeah, and Georgie. So yeah, I guess she has 3 other partners, and then comes back around to Rocky. And Rocky is the relationship that means something to her in her life, and the others, I guess, are just for
Yeah.
her own enjoyment. Or
Kind
and
of. Yeah.
as you said, it's Ed Wood exploring his own fetishes. And so whatever you're into, Ed wanted to have maybe something for you. Like if you wanted a scene with a guy in drag, he's got that. If you wanted some S&M scenes, he's got that. If you
Right.
wanted a lesbian scene, he's got that. And of course they with Georgie, she takes that demon marijuana, and it's
Oh my. Yes.
it just leads her right down the path to ruin. Ed really makes a big deal out of the pot use in this book, but
He really does. Yeah. He does. We'll get to that,
we'll
because
get to it.
that's a little bit later. A little
We'll
bit
get to it.
later when Rocky confronts Angie, and it's really it's almost like Rocky's key. Um, it's the key hinge upon which his relationship with Angie sort of revolves, whether or not she has been, regularly smoking pot. Right.
Right.
Right. So we'll get to that. Going back to yes, Angie does go on a sort of field trip, and she's a bit of an enigmatic character. It's kind of unclear exactly why she engages in these relationships. At one point early on, she says, "I just don't want to be by myself. I'd rather be around people."
Right.
But her sexual encounter with Georgie, who is described as a bull dyke, an aging lesbian who dresses as a man, and who is into S&M. She's had a long-standing relationship with Georgie, and she hasn't seen her in quite some time. But what happens from a narrative standpoint is, early on in the book, Rocky takes ill. He gets some sort of
Yeah.
stomach flu, and he's ill for a couple of days. And it's during that time that Angie, I guess, needing some sort of interaction with other humans, goes to see Georgie. She spends a night, or spends some time rather, with Sonny Jones. It's kind of interesting too.
Yeah.
They're all very different sexual scenarios that Angie engages in with these folks. Sonny, I think she enjoys the relationship she has with Sonny, and she does talk about it as if they've had some interactions in the past. Sonny's a very shy, gentleman, and what she seems to enjoy most is really getting him all sort of worked up and hot under the collar. That's the piece of the action that
Right.
she enjoys most. With Georgie, yeah, her and Georgie smoke some marijuana, and she hasn't done that at that point in quite some time. Then she floats off onto what she describes as "quote unquote" pink clouds. Right, that's Ed's best description
Oh, he
for what it's
loves
like
that.
to smoke weed. Is you're floating off on a pink cloud. Um,
Yeah.
so and then Georgie, of course, engages in S&M scene with Georgie. Georgie engages in an SM scene rather with Angie that leaves Angie literally welted and marked for the better part of the next week. And even as we get into the next week, by which point she's back together with Rocky, she's kind of avoiding Rocky until the welts go away because presumably she doesn't want him to know that she's been back together with Georgie. It becomes unclear, Joe, to me, like
Yeah.
is Rocky care more about her hanging out with people from the strip and smoking weed? Does he not care? Because he knows Sonny Jones and they have a warm relationship in the few interactions that they have. So
Yeah.
does he know about that? And does Rocky really care if she's sexually active with other partners, or what's his hang up, right?
It's very unclear.
Mhm.
Sometimes Rocky, I think, becomes a mouthpiece for Ed Wood. I think Rocky sometimes in his uh, views toward the Sunset Strip crowd, he
Yeah.
becomes, a surrogate in the story for Ed Wood's own views. Um, it's unclear what he would think if uh, it's unclear what he would think if he knew that uh, Angie's still getting together with Georgie, or if she's getting together with Sonny, or getting together with Rance. I don't know. And it's not, I don't think it's ever described that Rocky hooks up with anybody else.
Right. That's I
He,
picked that up too.
he
It,
does remain faithful to her.
he does. He does have that moment of flirtation with one of the extras on the set.
Yes, I
And
remember her.
it's just a moment and we never return to it. So Rocky ultimately, yeah, at the end of the book, you look back on it, other folks seem to be in these possess a very fluid sort of sexuality, whereas Rocky's very much just um, I want to say almost straight laced, straight. He wants to
Yeah.
just be engaged in a fairly normal heterosexual relationship. Normal, take that with a grain of salt, obviously, because Rance Holiday, the former director, he's now retired at this point, a year after What's the Difference, because he was in fact introduced in What's the Difference. He's now retired, but as we learn more about him, initially we see that he's just a quote unquote drag queen in What's the Difference. But as we get deeper into What's After, the organization sort of baits him with a sexual relationship with a teenage black boy,
Black,
and
yeah.
he's clearly finds that appealing, actually. And same with Angie. Again, she has different kinds of relationships with different people. A fairly normal sort of again, I that's the wrong word, but
Right.
heterosexual relationship with Sonny. Her relationship with Rance is almost entirely rooted in the clothing, right?
Right.
She knows that she needs to dress up prior, that Rance wants to see her undress and then exchange clothes with her. And she's in
Yeah.
fact wearing a red Angora dress. So that's another element. It's usually about one or two pages into the beginning of each chapter, and Angie is in virtually every chapter, 1 or 2 pages into the chapter, where we get a description of the Angora item that Angie's wearing, because we get different colors. It becomes almost like uh, there's orange, red, there's violet Angora, there's there's cardigans, there's a slip over, there's a pullover.
He's so obsessed with the Angora in this. He uses the term so often that at one
Mm,
point, I think he has to say, just for variety's sake, the fur that's only available in the Italian Alps. I think
hmm
he specifically mentions the Italian Alps. But as in almost all of the things that he writes, Ed is so focused on what the female characters are wearing all
yeah,
throughout. He will describe every item of clothing that she's wearing. And at one point, when uh, Rocky is meeting on the Sunset Strip with um, the bad guys, Sawtooth and Callie. Sawtooth and Callie are with a couple of teenage girls, and Ed even describes what they're wearing.
yeah.
And I didn't know what poor boy sweaters are, but he says, "Oh, they're wearing poor boy sweaters." But I think if anybody knows sweater terminology, it's got to be Ed. He is
Sure.
So this is another example of, this is supposed to be a book about Watts. The first, this is supposed to be a duology of books about Watts. And Ed works, first off, the Western thing in, and he works the Angora thing in as often as he can, because this is his book and he wants to, whatever Ed does, he's putting his own obsessions into it rather than what the book is supposed to be about.
Right, right. That's a good place. We'll jump back into the narrative itself, but that's a good place to jump off, because we discussed this when we talked about What's the Difference, and I think it's challenging for me to understand. Did he have this much license as a paperback writer? In other words, he had no. He just needed to produce a manuscript. If it had even a modicum of odd sexuality and fetishes and lingerie and a little bit of action in it, was that enough? The paperback publisher couldn't have cared less. And then that leads to the next question, which
Sure.
is, what would the audience have thought? Right, the presumed audience would have been like, what the hell is this? I think
that happens on a lot of Ed Wood's films and books, where they're written as obvious exploitation, and then you wonder what could the audience have thought. And it almost pulls me back to a line in Tim Burton's film Ed Wood, where he's supposed to make a movie about the Christine Jorgensen story, and then Percy Weiss character says, the rest of it is about a schmuck in an Angora sweater. And he says, well, I have a sex change. And he says, yeah, 2 pages before it ends. But I was thinking about this as I was reading What's After. Was the dirty bookstore a customer getting his money's worth out of this book? And I think I would say yes. I think there's enough. I think certainly there are so many descriptions of Angie's anatomy that I think they're getting their money's worth. I think there's plenty of sex scenes in it. I don't know what they could have thought. I don't know who was looking again for the erotic novel based on the Watts riots. I don't think anybody was.
right.
But I think there's plenty of sexuality in it, enough to satisfy,
There is certainly it's especially the first half of the book. Again, Angie seems to have one sexual escapade after the other, and then probably the primary sexual episode in the book. Not to jump all the way to the climax, but Angie and Rocky do finally. I think it is one of the only times in the book where they have sex numerous times in What's the Difference. But I think this is the only time in the book where finally they come together towards the tail end of the book, and we'll get to this because it's I found it quite affecting, actually.
Yeah, it is in the context of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So jumping back to Watts, the element of Watts is very little in the background, obviously, throughout both What's the Difference and What's After. It is a backdrop, though, for characters like Sawtooth and Callie, and the reason why they approach Rocky, and they still have a game plan, the quote-unquote organization to disrupt society, and essentially it's clearer what their intent is. The organization's intent is much clearer in What's After than it was, to me, at least to my mind, than it was in What's the Difference, where their interest is purely of self-interest. They have no desire to change the world. There's no social consciousness aspect to it. Sawtooth and Callie work for an organization, and they work for a leader who really only cares about how can I exploit people.
Right. And towards that end, they are bringing in a figurehead that we have not really talked about, or a new spokesman. Swahili, who I guess is coming from Africa.
I didn't really pick it up one way or the other. Yeah.
What he was supposed to be, because they say, well, isn't it nice that he came all this way to talk to us? And Swahili is touring the country and lecturing college students. And I don't know who he was supposed to be inspired by or based on. I don't know if it was supposed to be like Malcolm X or whom he's supposed to be.
I thought a little bit of that, and I thought perhaps a little bit of other sort of black organizations. Some of the names are escaping me off the top of my head, but the description of Swahili was a young, thin man wearing a very nice suit with a thin tie, and
Mm-hmm.
so you could think you could connect that, perhaps to some other organizations. But it did ring of
Right.
Malcolm X to me for sure.
Right. And we see how the organization has come up in the world from the first book, because it started with Preacher Moses, who
Right.
was, as they say, uh, screwing old ladies for $5 or whatever, a pop. And now they want to go classy. They only want to be seen in nice clothes. They want mainstream media attention.
Right.
So they're moving up in the world. They've gone from this kind of low hustle, this low class hustle, to they want to go nationwide with this thing. So
Yep.
that's an interesting phenomenon to watch throughout this book. Even though I guess it all springs from Ed Wood's very fevered imagination of what he thinks the civil rights movement is about, or what he thinks the Black Power movement is about. I don't know. I don't know where he's getting his information, but
Yeah, it was after we had done the review of What's the Difference. It was Jim Ponalillo, who was here on the first Wood Summit podcast, had provided a little bit of additional information talking about how he didn't entirely make up a conspiracy out of whole cloth, but in fact, the communists, the Communist International early on didn't try to align with some, you know, black rights groups way back. Yeah, we're talking 1920s, 1930s. And I think Jim had said by about 1939, that relationship had started to fray a little bit. But there still was an attempt, a right-wing conspiracy, perhaps, an attempt to smear Black Power organizations as if they had been controlled by the communists. Because, of course,
right.
the communists are always the bogeyman. Um, but but yeah, it's not obviously something that he dwells on throughout the book. It's just a little bit clearer in this book that whatever those stated political ideologies and motivations are, they're bogus. They're absolutely bogus. The characters are
Right.
strictly interested in what's good for them.
Yep.
And
This is purely a money scam, and so
yeah,
they just want to exploit, and make as much money as they can. But they want to have the image of being respectable, or that not, or at least the image of looking good in the suits and looking good on television, which is what leads up to the final action of the book.
right. And
Mm,
they've switched their uh, agenda to a degree, right? It's perhaps having learned a lesson from Watts, which it's stated a few times in the book that really didn't accomplish anything. Watts
right,
ultimately didn't accomplish anything. They've now shifted their gears into influencing the beatnik characters around the Sunset Strip. That's where they decide that
it's
the right place to foment civil discord and disruption will be if we can get the stoner kids and the beatnik kids and the kids with long hair who you can't tell
right.
if they're a man or a woman. We get them to riot, and then we've taken this nationally to the next level.
It's surprising to me how often in 60s and maybe early 70s pop culture you get jokes on TV shows and things based on, you can't tell who are the boys and who are the girls, what with
Right.
this long hair. And how many jokes in TV shows and movies are like, the person with long hair turns around and it's a girl, it's a guy with a beard or something. I just saw that in a movie. And the weirdest one was, I watched the Carol Burnett show reruns on MeTV, and they were showing some of the early Carol Burnett shows. And interestingly, Carol grew up in Hollywood, right across the street from
Yeah.
Playboy Liquor. So um, what happened is, somebody in the audience, she always has a Q&A, and they asked her, "What do you think of men with long hair?" And she says, "Oh, I don't like that. I like the men to look like men and the women to look like women." At that time, Carol Burnett had super short hair. She had like, it was barely longer than what an army
Right.
recruit would wear. So I thought that was a very odd comment for her to make. But so many jokes on the Tonight Show and Laugh-In and so many comedies are about, you can't tell the boys from the girls. And Ed is of course, all about that, even though by the 70s, he had long hair. He had like shoulder
Exactly.
length hair. And was, of course, trying to make himself look feminine whenever he could. So it was odd that he would be moralizing about that. And of course, he calls them beatniks, which Hollywood never understood what the beat movement was about. And certainly Ed didn't. The magic word I don't think is ever used. The word that I kept waiting for, hippies.
Yep. Right.
The word hippie I don't think is ever used.
It's not.
He talks about beatniks and bongos. He goes on about bongos, like bongos was the 50s, man. I don't know. Like beatniks playing bongos and reading poetry, he thinks is like the height of youth culture. But this, the changing of the Sunset Strip is a topic that fascinates Ed. He writes about it a lot, not just in this novel, but in other stories and novels. And in this, we finally get this long and strange passage about the Sunset Strip being personified as the old lady of the Sunset Strip.
Bizarre, right? I had to catch myself as I got into the first page or two of that chapter, right?
That's the one place where I had to stop and say, like, what is he talking about? He sees the Sunset Strip as a person.
Yes.
And this person has been hanging out with different crowds over the years, like
right.
the movie stars of the 30s and 40s. And now they're the beatniks and then the surfer kids. And
she'll be around 100 years from now, and there'll be a different crowd occupying the Sunset Strip, right?
So
that's one of the latest chapters in the book, but it is the one chapter in the book that veers sort of sharp
right
off of the narrative, and you're kind of because again he does personify that as if it's a character, and the whole entire chapter he speaks from that perspective. He does get into sort of very historical minutia about the Strip and about how tourists at some point were the main crowd who was hanging out there, and then again these beatniks come in. It is interesting that he doesn't use the word hippie, but it's partly the reason this ties back to the narrative, so it's not strictly him pontificating or dwelling on his own obsessions, is because Angie comes from that world, so to speak. She had attended bar on the Strip, and she hung out at those kinds of disreputable places, and she met characters like Georgie and things of that nature. So that's still, to some degree, she has an affinity for that, and Rocky knows that.
And why are you hanging out with those?
Right, and he's a little skeptical of that. He's a little skeptical of that. But there is a moment later in the book where there's a very positive spin put on the Sunset Strip crowd, where it talks about, but despite all of that, these kids are way more tolerant. You can live and be free here in Hollywood. Unlike other places in the world where you may be judged, you could still live and be free. So he's kind of having it both ways, perhaps. Rocky's viewpoint, again, is a little bit older, conservative viewpoint. And that lines up that whole, this is where it's at, and, free sexuality, fluid sexuality, wear your hair as long as you want. That's actually a very common sort of theme that runs through editorials you wrote for a lot of Pendulum magazines. That more positive spin on the whole culture exists in short stories and magazines as we get through the latter part of the 60s and into the early 70s a little bit more prominently. Generally speaking, though, the tag on Ed is that he had this old, hardened conservative viewpoint, which again, there's a balance here, but sometimes that exists. That exists, right?
Well, I think sometimes the debates that go on between Rocky and Angie might be the debates that are going on in Ed Wood's own head. And you talked about a tolerance, and there was another passage of the book that talked about another group that is tolerant, and that is people in show business.
Yes.
Show people are tolerant, and the reason why their tolerance is important in this book is, of course, that it revolves around an interracial relationship and a marriage. And Ed writes that people in show business are more apt to be tolerant of an interracial relationship than people outside of show business would be.
Right. He actually he refers to it as "quote unquote" theater, the people who are in theater
people,
and he capitalizes it. He likes every now and then sort of randomly capitalizing a word. Theater is one of them. He still capitalizes, as he did in Wants the Difference, words like the organization or Black Power. So this sort of random capitalization, you'll see that in a lot of texts. You'll see that also in a lot of short stories and other paperbacks, as well as magazine articles. You name it. He likes doing that.
Although I think in this book there is relatively little formatting weirdness to it. He can go
Right.
way weirder than this, and he almost doesn't even use the ellipses that much.
No.
He does do some random capitalization and writing things in all caps. He'll do that just occasionally, but there are some stories, short stories especially, where he'll just let that run wild and almost to the point where it's unreadable, where you look at it and like, what was he doing that day? And I think it's just because Ed typed very fast, and if he really got into the mood to write all this stuff in capital letters, I think he would. But again, that's why I think he must have been a little bit more sane and sober when he
I
wrote this
agree.
book.
I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, it is a sober book compared to, by and large, many other books,
Yeah,
especially if you were just to compare it to What's the Difference in
yeah,
and of itself. They're so vastly different, even though they involve mostly the same characters and some of the same themes and narrative elements. They're vastly different books.
yeah. That's why I would say the first one might be tough sailing for somebody who's not an Ed Wood fanatic or anything. And the second book, I think, is much more digestible. And uh, it does basically stand on its own. They explain the important stuff from the first book. I don't think you really have to have read the first book to
Right?
understand this. I think maybe towards the end, when he's talking about the Mala Smith character,
Yeah.
it would have been helpful to have read the first book to know what they had gone through and how he and Mala got involved and why she died. But
Yeah. Well,
mostly
that
you don't have to know.
right, that moment, it's a just one chunk of paragraph where
Paragraph near the end.
Rocky
Yeah.
kind of reflects back briefly on all the people who had gotten ground up within the organization,
Yeah.
and including some people that are mentioned in this book, like Preacher Moses, the head
Preacher
of the
Moses,
Mosites.
Preacher Moses and the Mosites for being gone and Preacher being dead. He gets a lot of mentions in this book.
He
Preacher
does,
Moses is kind of a character in this book
he
without even being
does.
alive.
He does, but Rocky kind of does a quick A to Z of all the people who have been ground up by the organization, including Malice Smith, and she is not up until that point. And this is
Yeah,
literally like in one of
like
the
the last
last
pages of the
chapter.
book.
She's not been mentioned prior to that, not whatsoever. But he had a bit of a torrid relationship with Mala back in What's the Difference. It is
Mhm.
his relationship here is, of course, entirely focused on Angie, his
Yeah,
relationship with Angie, and it does for me. It actually becomes increasingly affecting. I thought as we
yeah,
get, I was concerned a little bit. Angie seems to be kind of flitting around. I actually, Joe, no kidding, arrived at a point somewhere about 2/3 of the way into the book where I thought, knowing Ed and knowing sort of how he, having read other paperbacks and especially the short stories where he can, the sting in the tail,
right.
I fully well was expecting, not wanting it to happen, but expecting that Angie was going to be the one who was going to turn on him. She sort of I won't he asked the question, will you marry me, before we get to the very tail end of the book, and she
Mhm.
delays the answer, and she says, I'll answer that question after the night when you have to, perform for the organization, which is in front of a live television audience, and he has a prepackaged speech, which is he's going to, spout all of the organization's key points and ideologies and agendas. And
Mhm.
it turns out it was wonderful. I love the
Yeah,
way that it ended. I felt like it was just really, it's, again, it didn't 100% surprise me, but I would have been less surprised, I think, if Rocky had somehow, frankly gotten a bullet in the head and Angie was the one who
right.
had turned him in.
Because especially Ed's short stories often take a really negative turn in the last
Yeah.
third of them. And maybe Ed was in an optimistic mood, or he was, feeling more generous toward his characters.
Yeah.
In, and I think that he actually has come to quite like Rocky Alley.
Yeah, I do too.
I think he really likes Rocky Alley and admires Rocky Alley and is rooting for him. So we're rooting for him too. So yeah, Ed does play some nasty surprises on a lot of his characters and other things, but yeah, it doesn't happen here. And yeah, maybe that's progress on Ed's part, that he doesn't feel the need to bring the hammer of God down on his characters, because he so often does.
Right.
You
It
know,
that's why I said earlier I found it very affecting. But so the sex scene between Rocky and Angie, She said a bit earlier in one of their interactions, let's make a baby. Let's make a baby, which is a big moment as you read through it, because they're kind of playing this dance with each other where they don't seem entirely committed to one another. And then, as we've said, Angie is, of course, pursued some other sexual relationships, but it's very evident that they both have they have a strong passion for each other. That was evident in
Right.
What's the Difference, and that maintains certainly, but they still somehow are a bit at arm's length. And I think it was when Angie said, let's make a baby together, words to that effect, that we get over the hump, we get to the next level. And that's when, Rocky wants to know, because the people in the organization have told him, watch out for Angie. She's hanging around, a rough crowd. So,
Right.
but spoiler alert, right? As if we haven't already spoiled the whole entire thing, if you plan on reading it. But so they have a sex scene together, which Ed describes. He pulls out all the stops. He talks, there's lightning, there's thunder. His
Okay.
language gets extremely over the top during the sex scene. And of course, it ends with Angie confident that that was the sex we had where we finally made a baby. Yeah.
Well, if you want a contrast to that, there is a similarly dramatic sex scene in the movie Dropout Wife, where the dropout wife, I'm sorry, I should know her name because I wrote a book about Steve Apostolov, but the main character has sex with her husband out in like a garden. And I think there might be actually a storm happening. And she knows after having sex with her husband, this very dramatic sex scene, that she is now pregnant.
I completely forgot about that. Thank you for
And
that.
then this shows you how Ed's optimism in the 60s had soured into pessimism of the 70s, because then the husband and wife get along very poorly after she's pregnant. He slaps her across the face. She falls down to the kitchen floor. She has a miscarriage. Like, it's a really dark and dramatic sequence that kind of, I don't know why it's in the movie, because it kind of, if it was supposed to be an erotic movie, like, I don't know what the scene is doing in the movie, but it's another scene where a character has sex and realizes, oh, I'm pregnant. Like, that was, because I think they already had 2 kids. And I think she says that was number 3, and it shows you how negative Ed had gotten by the early 70s,
Right.
because that scene turns out poorly. Although I guess if you are really sick, you could argue that Dropout Wife has a optimistic ending. I don't know. It's because she goes back to the husband who slapped her. So, but in this, you see that Rocky and Angie have a deep connection, and they are building something together, and that's something that's pure. And my God, after at the climax of this book, Rocky starts reciting the Gettysburg Address.
Right. Right.
Oh, by the way, okay, this book has a little bit of Lincoln trivia
It does.
that I could not confirm this,
I never heard that either.
that he was supposed to be such an alcoholic that he had his bedroom on the ground floor so that he would not fall out the window.
Yes.
And I was like, is that a problem for alcoholics? Are they constantly falling out windows?
No, I don't think
I've
so.
never heard of that happening one time.
Right.
But Ed does include that. And then I looked up the Lincoln bedroom, but it turned out the Lincoln bedroom in the White House had actually been an office in Lincoln's day. So I couldn't confirm that Lincoln was such a drunk that he was afraid of falling out the White House window. I thought that was insane.
No,
But
I thought same. I thought I've never heard that before. I thought, is that just sort of made up? It's actually presented about halfway through the book,
yeah,
apropos of almost nothing, again, other than
random.
to slam Lincoln. And Lincoln is never mentioned whatsoever again until, as Joe said, I think it's on the very last page of the book.
Last page, he starts.
It's actually he's talking, and he literally transitions into reading the Gettysburg Address. And it's at that point, here's the huge spoiler alert, at which Angie finally says, "I'll marry you." What she was doing, we then realized, was making sure that Rocky was going to stand up for the right thing to do, so to speak, that he wasn't going
Yeah.
to cave and read the prepackaged speech that the organization had provided him, but he was going to instead, I guess, go off the top of his head into a recitation of the Gettysburg Address, which
Yeah, he does.
but that last
Eh,
line, then she says, and let's get married. Again, I'm paraphrasing. It's again very affecting the way it's all put
yeah.
together.
I think that is actually that's quite sweet.
Hmm.
That Rocky and Angie's relationship is presented in quite a sweet way. Um, and the thing that I guess I liked about this whole structure of this novel that leads up to that moment is that, again, the formula for telling a story I've heard described once as you get your hero up a tree, and then in Act 2 you throw rocks at him, and then Act 3 you get him down.
Yeah.
And that's what happens here, is that at the beginning of the book, we get Rocky Alley up a tree. And then in Act 2, we throw rocks at him, more troubles, more problems. And then in Act 3, he gets himself down off of the tree, basically,
Right.
because the organization says, like, we'll expose you if you don't go along with us. We'll tell about your past. We can ruin your career. And so he feels like he's trapped. And then at the end, he's just like, you know what? I'm just going to say what's on my mind, and I'm not going to be a boss to anybody. I think Muddled Mind said that he was probably going to get beat up or killed like 5 seconds later by the organization, but I don't know what happens to him right after he makes that speech.
Yeah, there's no way of knowing. I think he makes a calculated decision that he's on live television. So if anything, he's going to be protected by the fact that now everybody knows if something happens to Rocky Alley, it's only going to substantiate his point. It's unclear though, because it does
Yeah.
literally end. It's Ed is more concerned about closing the loop on Angie and Rocky's relationship.
Yeah.
So I wonder, though, it made me wonder, did he ever think about perpetuating the story of Rocky Alley? Because it does leave loose ends,
It
very
does.
loose ends.
There
Yeah,
could definitely have been a third one. Maybe he couldn't
right.
come up with another Watts parody name, like another Watts pun. We had Watts the Difference and Watts After, and
Yeah.
What's Happening Now, I guess, could have been the third one. By the way, this is just a random thing that I wrote down. We were talking that the only other person that the only other female that Rocky really interacts with is a bit player in his Western show. And I wrote down her name, Randy Oasis,
I forgot.
because
Thank you for writing that down. Yeah, that's
Randy
beautiful.
Oasis is a great character name. And there's also a Shirley in the book, obviously, and a
There is
Rance.
briefly.
There's
Shirley's a
briefly a
bartender.
Shirley,
Yeah,
and so we're putting all the you know we're putting
right,
all the classic Ed names. Of course, there's a major character named Rance, and Rance is one of his favorite character
right.
names.
Rance.
Um,
Randy is a name actually that comes up in Ed's
and
writing
Randy,
fairly frequently. Yeah.
and briefly, there's even a character named Mac. Somebody even says there's someone briefly mentioned named Mac, and Ed loves to have characters named Mac. Like
Yep.
in Plan 9 from Outer Space, they're talking on the radio with somebody named Mac in the control tower.
Mac.
So there's a
So, and I think Mac was perhaps influenced by his son-in-law, Michael McCarty. Mac. He went by the
cool,
name Mac McCarty. So, don't know, right? But
possibly.
he did tend to draw from his own circle of associates and life events and things like that often. But so let me think back for a second. So Swahili. We need to go back to
Oh,
Swahili briefly.
Swahili.
So not only is he the character, but the that's the sort of movement as well, right? And it's left nebulously during What's the Difference, but it seems as if the organization's express intent in What's the Difference is to actually get everybody ultimately to speak Swahili. That's never
Mm-hmm.
mentioned in What's After, but now we have a character named
Just not
Swahili
Swahili.
who is leading a movement which is essentially dubbed Swahili.
I think at this point, Ed was just using Swahili as shorthand, basically, for the Back to Africa movement, or, the Afrocentric movement, or the Black Power movement. He was just, you're right. In the first book, there's this whole plan to get people speaking Swahili. And then the second, he just calls the bad guy Swahili.
Yeah.
And I don't know that Swahili is all that intimidating sometimes as a villain, because it seemed like Sawtooth would be willing to sacrifice Swahili if Swahili got in the way of what I think Sawtooth might actually kind of be the real power in this novel. And I was surprised to go back to find that Sawtooth and Callie are not in the first book at all that I could find.
Right.
Because they're treated like they were like the main
Rocky
bad
knew
guys.
them, like he knew Sawtooth in particular.
At least, but Callie is kind of the new like sidekick or assassin guy. But Sawtooth is new to this book, but I think he might be he might consider himself like the real power. And I think Swahili might just be a figurehead and somebody that they can get on television. And I think Swahili is a better performer.
Right.
Maybe Sawtooth doesn't get on TV because he doesn't give pretty speeches on TV the way Swahili is able to. Although I don't know if we ever hear any of Swahili's supposedly galvanizing speeches.
We don't. I don't think we do.
We're just told that he goes from college campuses and stuff and mesmerizes people.
He'll be the president one day. I think it's mentioned at one point.
That is
it is
the
mentioned
first
at one point.
Negro president. There's never been a Negro president. And the black man will never be free until Swahili is president. So,
right. And you're right. Sawtooth seems like the heavy hand, no doubt about it. But it's the organization is nebulous to a degree in What's the Difference. It's in microcosm really in What's After, where it is, you know, Sawtooth and Callie are almost entirely representative of it until Swahili's character comes along. And we don't really ever get any insight into the rest of the organization whatsoever. Now, Swahili does have the last line in one of the later chapters in the book, which is a hilarious, for me, I literally laugh out loud moment. But Callie and Rocky get into a little bit of a dust up. And Swahili said, Sawtooth at that point is going to take Rocky out. But Swahili says, we can't, words to this effect, we can't do this here. This is Beverly Hills.
Yes. That line is so much like, you can't fight in here. This is the war room. So I love that line about Beverly Hills. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's such a great.
It made me laugh out loud. I loved it. Yeah.
That was a great line. Oh, another, if we're a random good quote. Is one thing that Rance Holiday is that there are two things that Rance does not joke about: making movies and wearing women's clothes.
Right.
Those are the two things Rance will not joke about. And I thought, that is Ed. I mean, making movies and wearing women's clothes. So I was like, never is it more clear, like when a character is speaking for the author than in that moment. So the two things, the two passions of Ed's life were making movies and wearing women's clothes.
Right. Rance shows up a little bit more frequently here than he does in What's the Difference, and he's presented largely as a positive character. He gets sucked into the organization's scheme as well.
Very reluctantly.
One thing that was odd to me was all of a sudden I'm thinking, how did they also hook? Why would the small group of people who are associated with each other, you can understand Rocky, Angie, Rance's in the film industry, etc. But then Georgie, who is, a dope dealer from the strip, an aged bull dyke, all of a sudden she's become one of their principal hopes for creating all this social discord. Of course, it goes badly for her because they are using her and she doesn't know it. Yeah.
Well, Georgie is kind of an interesting character because Rance flashes back to his early days with her. And then you find that Georgie tried to make it in show business or tried to make it in pictures and never did. So I guess she just stayed in Hollywood and just became a drug dealer or something.
Exactly. Right.
The only thing I could think of about her character was that she must have been a well-known strip character. Maybe she was like infamous on the Sunset Strip and like all the kids knew her or something. Right. Like maybe she's like
the way Rance tells it, or in that segment of the book where they're talking about their past, is that they were both kind of trying to come up in the industry, right? And at some point, she was really well known and well regarded as throwing all the best parties in
Right.
Hollywood. But yeah, at some point, obviously, that completely falls apart. It begs the question, as you said it, you have to wonder, is Rance obviously, quite obviously, partly based upon some of Ed's own biography. So where does a character like Georgie come from? It's very commonplace for him to base characters on other people. Um,
Yeah.
so you wonder about a character like Georgie. It's the kind of thing that's instructive if you're a real hardcore Ed obsessive. As you're reading through other things, this is how you sort of build your foundation of understanding around all of his crazy themes and motifs and the things he's drawing from.
Well, this to me, she was very much fit that same bull dyke stereotype that you see in the hose nosed Kate loves Calamity Jane,
Yes.
Cattle Ann, or whatever. He's got
Right,
three
right.
names in it, but it's hose nosed Kate, whom I describe as sort of a lesbian Jabba the Hutt, and she's
Oh,
very much, yeah, she's very much what like Georgie is in this
I didn't even
story.
think of it now that we're talking about it, but think about sleazy Maisie Rumpeldink and Take
Sleazy
It Out in
Maisie
Trade,
Rumpeldink,
who's
another
a
one.
drug dealer, right? Who is in fact a
Yeah.
drug dealer, and
So he loves to have this particular, this is a little character type that he likes to work into his stories and films. So that's where I think Kate, that's where not host knows Kate, but that's where I think Georgie comes from.
right,
That's why I think it's just a character type that he likes. And maybe, Ed knew a lot of people in Hollywood. Ed went to a lot of weird parties. Ed went to a lot of bars.
right.
She might be a composite of all of the
Like you said,
lesbians that he knew.
some character from the strip. I'm sure there were many of them that he was
Yeah. So
familiar with. Um, we talked a little bit last time about a couple subjects came up, and I mistakenly mentioned, you corrected me though, but just for clarity, Burn Baby Burn by Ray Jones is actually not a reprint of Watts After, which I mistakenly mentioned, but
it's
it's What's the Difference, the first book in the series.
right.
Just to get clarity around it. We also talked briefly, when could these have exactly been written? We know that both of these books have a 1967 copyright. It was subsequently revealed, thankfully, uh, that um, the Ed Wood estate, Kathy Wood's estate, and I'll mention him by name because he's always been a pretty big advocate of Ed Wood. Bob Blackburn shared, after we did that first podcast, an image from the cover page of What's the Difference, Ed's own copy, and it had October 1966 written on it in Ed's own
Right.
hand. So that dates to when he wrote it. We talked about that, speculated on that in the first podcast. When he wrote What's the Difference, or What's After, rather, it does also carry a 1967 copyright. It's published by the same publisher, Pad Library, out of Agora, California. But Bob did not have a copy of that one to give us Ed's own hand inscribed date. All we know is copyright 1967. I feel like it could have been written soon after,
Yeah.
or even a little bit later, but they're not all that, although the characters and some of the narrative elements are connected. Ed's in an extremely different frame of mind when he writes What's After as opposed to What's the Difference.
Yeah. The one thing that really ties it down to a very specific time in history is that, again, not really tied into the greater overall narrative. Ed describes the Sunset Strip curfew riots in this book.
Mm,
Um, and there's one point at which Rocky is actually watching news coverage of the Sunset Strip curfew riots and cries, I think, because he's so sad of what's happening in his city. And the Sunset Strip curfew riots had nothing to do with Watts at all. It was basically white kids going to rock and roll clubs, and the cops kind of cracking the whip on them and trying to, get them to go home at like 10 o'clock or something.
right.
And it was basically white kids who didn't want to stop partying, and that was the Sunset Strip curfew riots. It didn't have anything to do with racism or
Right.
strife between African Americans and the police. It was just basically a lot of rowdy hippies who wanted to get stoned and party all night, and the cops wanted to kick them out and make them go home. And
Certainly,
Ed,
I was going to say, certainly we need to talk a little bit more about that, the parties, right? The weed and things of that nature. I do, my dogs are for whatever reason going crazy. So I don't like to stop us in midstream, but I am gonna pause us for a moment and
sure.
literally just a moment, Joe, and we will be right back. Okay, sorry about that, folks. I needed a quick break there. And what else outstanding do we still have to cover here, Joe?
Not much, just that the Sunset Strip curfew riots are kind of a footnote to history. So I would have to imagine that Ed must have written these right around the time that they were happening. And I think that was in 1966.
Okay.
And so I think that's about the time that Ed might have been writing writing this book, because that would have been very fresh in his mind. So, and he sees it, I think, as another symptom of the crumbling of society, or the maybe the communist conspiracy to take over America through the youth and the bongos and the beatniks. But in reality, it just seems like some hippies who wanted to party.
So a good segue into we mentioned, of course, it's of concern to Rocky that Angie may be still spending some time down on the Sunset Strip and smoking marijuana. He calls it marijuana, pot, weed. He actually
Right.
describes it in a few different ways, but he describes it uh, as in her case when she gets stoned when she has her escapade with Georgie, that she's quote unquote on pink clouds, and he presents it as a fairly positive sort of um, experience. But in other iterations talking about the same subject later on in the book, he talks about it in a way, is it as if it's Angie, for Angie, this is why it's okay with Rocky that she smoked weed recently, kind of fell off the wagon to a degree, because
Yeah.
she's never become an addict and it's never become a gateway drug for her, because of course, Georgie and others are all the way into heroin, which in today's world, the association around marijuana is so vastly different than it was then. But Ed clearly had a association around marijuana that it could be fun, but it could also be something quite destructive, right?
I always have to wonder, I mean, Ed maintains in his books and his movies such a staunch anti-drug stance. I have to wonder, though, if at any point in his history in Hollywood, if he ever, like, he must have taken like a puff off a joint or something at one point.
I would have to think so too. I mean, how could he almost how could he not have, given the
He
milieu that
must
he
have
was living
had.
in? And but I thought, Rocky, of course, is okay with the fact he's able to overlook that recent transgression of Angie's and able to move on in their relationship. She's happy that Rocky has stepped up and he throws the organization's objectives and ideologies to the wayside and stands up and recites the Gettysburg Address, and everything comes to a really positive end. And it's
Patriotic.
surprising if you read a lot of Ed's books. It's
Yeah.
very surprising.
Yeah, because he can be bleak. Again, seeing Rocky as a mouthpiece character for Ed, when Rocky is talking about the youth culture and then the kids on the Sunset Strip and the protesters and things, it reminds me so much of the class reunion, when there's a scene in the class reunion when I believe Rick Lutz looks out the window. He's getting back together with his college roommates, his college classmates, and they're in a bar. And then they look out the window and they see protesters outside. And he said, we didn't have anything like those street apes when we were in college and all this and stuff. And you would think, based on his age and his haircut and his general vibe, that Rick Lutz would probably be down with the protesters or not sitting in judgment of them. But Ed has him be, very stern and judgmental about them. But then there's a character, Harvey Shane says, be more lenient with them. So even in that movie, there's that debate going on between,
Yeah.
being very strict with them and being very disapproving. And then there's the other voice saying, be more lenient, and maybe we should be more lenient. I was thinking something that occurred to me. There was so much of a gap between the first time we recorded and the second time we recorded. On this Watts series, I had to read the book again, which was not a problem because it only takes a couple of hours to read. It's a very quick book. I noticed that Rocky is not totally at first willing to tell the whole truth to Angie. And eventually he does tell the truth to Angie. He lays it all
Yeah.
out for her. And I was saying that was structured just like Glenn or Glenda, where it's do I have a right to know? Yes, you have a right to know. Just say I'm not ready to
Great.
tell you right now.
Great catch.
And then all through that movie, all through Glenn or Glenda, and through the Apostolov movies and things like that, you have scenes where characters go to each other and unburden themselves by telling them their problems. Here are my problems. And then there's a sympathetic listener. This happens several times through this book. And it's something that Ed liked to have in his movies as well, where he tells his problems, where a character will tell their problems to another character. And somebody reviewing Glenn or Glenda, I think it was Danny Peary in Cult Movies 3, said that the characters in Ed Wood movies are like the ladies in soap operas, sitting around the kitchen table and telling their problems to each other. And I noticed that all through, I noticed that structure all through What's After, is that both Rocky and Angie individually will confide in people and tell them, because some people will always, because characters are always picking up on their bad mood, like, oh, are you in some kind of trouble? What
Right.
makes you think I'm in some kind of trouble? We haven't even talked about the alcohol code in
Oh,
this.
right.
Like
Oh,
what
God. How
kinds
could
of
we not have?
alcohol,
Right.
what kinds of alcohol you're allowed to drink. And you'll notice that Rance knows that Angie's in trouble when she asks for a gin and tonic and not just straight gin.
Mm-hmm.
And so martinis have one meaning, whiskey has a meaning. Ed usually has contempt for, but usually mentions the beer bars, which I don't know that I've been to too many bars that are just selling beer, but that's a big problem to Ed. He mentions the beer bars again in this. So there is definitely a hierarchy of alcohols. And I think the highest is whiskey.
In
And
Rocky's
then
mind, anyway. Right.
in Rocky's mind, and then the lowest you can go is
Gin.
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 So I don't know. I mean, to me, I don't drink, so I mean, it's all the same to me. I don't know. I maybe had alcohol on like 2 occasions in my entire life. I don't know what's good and isn't. I
Well,
know it all.
I'm sitting here drinking beer, by the way. So I do drink beer, but yeah, I've never been into a bar, Joe, that strictly serves beer.
Beer, but
It doesn't really exist. That's interesting. Yeah, we didn't really get into the alcohol consumption in the book. It's staggering. It's literally
yeah,
staggering.
these
They
characters are.
drink. Have their drinks refilled literally 3 sentences after in a conversation.
Mhm.
3 sentences after they've had the first drink filled, and they pour them down. It's only even remotely realistic for somebody who was as severe an alcoholic as Ed. You can't, the average person cannot consume that much alcohol in a short period of time without absolutely, passing out and becoming immediately obliterated. They drink, and it's not just a drink. It's a full glass of whiskey, or it's a full glass of gin. Every now and then they might drop a piece of ice into it, but they
Right.
slug them down in no time flat. And then they have 3 or 4 drinks in the space of what seems like in narrative terms is, 10 minutes transpiring.
There is the implication at one point that Rocky having drinks when he was sick, like, knocked him out for a while. That they said, oh, I only had like 1 or 2 drinks, and they said, oh, that was enough. So, but yeah, all the social interactions practically in this book revolve around drinking, and you're just required to have alcohol on hand. I used to watch old movies and old TV shows and wonder, like, oh man, do I just have to have like a liquor cabinet? Like, even though I don't drink, like, do I just have to have one of those? And I don't have a liquor cabinet, but maybe people did. Uh, you know, a question that occurred to me during this book: did Ed Wood smoke?
Yeah, he smoked a lot. He smoked
He
heavily.
smoked
Yeah.
because there's a little bit of smoking in this book, but
Hardly any. He
hardly
doesn't.
any. But
You're right. Actually, he doesn't mention it much in any of his literature. It was
so
so commonplace at the time that it,
you didn't even think
not
about it.
even, not even worth mentioning. But
But that's why, like in old movies and TV shows, you always see like ashtrays out everywhere. So
there's actually the scene in Glen or Glenda. You're going to recall this, Joe. I believe it's this scene. I could have this misrecollected, but the scene where he goes to buy lingerie. Uh,
yeah,
Glenn goes to buy lingerie. So he's at the counter, and once the uh, the salesperson realizes that he's not just buying it for his girlfriend, he has his own peculiar sort of interest in it, and she turns sour very, very quickly. You remember that scene? Right, right.
yes,
But just prior to that, as he walks in there and he walks up and says, I want to look at this, he's got a cigarette in his hand and he's smoking it. And he literally takes a drag on it and he throws it on the floor. Of course, he's in quality studios and he's in, an old, concrete building or whatever. But is that what you would do if you walked into a high-end lingerie shop? You would walk up to the counter and you
and
would
just
take a
throw
drag on
the.
your cigarette. You would just throw it right on their floor.
Well, maybe that's why that spinster-looking lady in the lingerie store is so upset.
Right,
But
right.
speaking of the lingerie, my God,
It's
Ed goes.
nonstop.
It's nonstop in this book, and Ed is so fascinated with fabrics and textures. Um, Everybody knows the Angora thing, but he talks a lot about marabou
He loves marabou. Yeah.
and velvet
Yep.
and silk, satin, nylon, whatever the underwear is made of, whatever the panties are made of. I think my favorite was the negligee with ostrich feathers.
Yes. How could you beat that?
Ostrich feathers there's a negligee with ostrich feathers, I think during the rants, one of the rants scenes. And ostrich feathers, wow. And I don't know that I've ever seen, maybe I've seen people wear ostrich feathers
In Vegas, right?
in Vegas, I guess.
Yeah.
But well, Vegas is mentioned in this book as one of the things siphoning away business
Right.
from Los Angeles,
From the strip.
because
And yep.
the classy people are going to, the classy folks are going to Vegas,
Yep.
because they don't want to stay in, they don't want to hang around these dirty beatniks and their bongos. They're going to Vegas to see Wayne Newton or something. So the thing that I think was great about this book is that had it not had a title page or cover at all, and it had just started with chapter 1, I would have 100% been able to tell that this was Ed Wood.
Sure.
It couldn't have been anybody else. It's so much his writing style, and his both his exposition and his dialogue has a certain rhythm to it, and the way his characters talk is all through this. So this is one. This is one of those books where Ed put in the first edition. I think he put his own name on the cover, but he scarcely needed to. We would have been able to tell. We would have been able to tell that this is Ed Wood and nobody else. So
For sure. For sure. And a lot of keywords. I won't get into all the different keywords,
no,
but there's too many. And even like you said, phraseology, certain sentence structures and common sentences,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. It's rampant throughout the book. So yeah, this is Ed through and through. So if you're looking for an Ed Wood book that is very characteristic of Ed,
Yeah.
you almost can't go wrong. He's always very characteristic of himself. But this one's very interesting because it does hew to a narrative, and it does hew to a structure a little bit more persistently than much of his other work. Very few of his paperbacks actually are sort of like I mentioned the word breezy, a nice easy breezy read where there's a lot not a lot happening. In fact, again, there's almost only one sole narrative. These guys finger Rocky to do a job for the organization, and it takes 150 or 160 pages for that to actually transpire.
This novel was so much easier to follow than the previous one. We'd actually had a plan at one point to review and talk about drag trade, and then eventually I turned that into a post at my blog. And drag trade is just such a random pile of scraps and like stuff that barely is coherent. And the chapters in drag trade can be anywhere from 50 pages long to like half a page long. So I noticed that in this book, the chapters are almost all they're very evenly spaced. And I think this would be a good book for, I think this would be a good book for intermediate ed fans. Maybe not the first thing that you should read of his novels, but early on, because you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get all of his eccentricities, and you still get a coherent, narrative, and you get a lot of Ed's politics and a lot of his thoughts about what was happening in Los Angeles at that time. So, yeah, this is I think this is definitely one to check out. Whereas I would say with what's the difference? It's definitely people should check that one out too, but they should be familiar with Ed's writing style first. I said they should read Blood Splatters Quickly or Angora Fever, and read a few of the stories in there and kind of get yourself into how Ed writes before you jump into although, of course, Ed couldn't have told that to the dirty bookstore customers of 1966 or 67. They would have just picked it up off the shelf and were like, what is this?
Right.
Again, I have to wonder what they were thinking. But yeah, this book is maybe, more accessible. This is on the more accessible side. Whereas I would say something like a drag trade almost defeated me. I was like, making my it's fascinating. It's a fascinating document. It's got all of Ed's themes in it, but it's written in such a weird start-stop manner. It's almost just like an anthology, sort of like a quasi anthology of random stuff.
Right.
That and like when Ed starts talking about like the androgynous people of Japan in that book, where there's like a whole part of it that's like in Japan where there's men who dress like women and women who dress like men. And I was like, I was lost at that point. But so this one is got a very strong main character and somebody that people can follow and empathize with. I don't know who said it in our group, but if the Watts books had been made into a movie, they had suggested, I think, Cleavon Little as the person to play Rocky, and I think Cleavon would have been excellent at it. I think Cleavon would have played it excellently, because Cleavon could do comedy, but you also need somebody who is a convincing action star.
Yeah, I don't think it was Cleavon Little. I'm trying to remember what the actor's name. It could have been. I could be misrecollecting it.
I think I thought it was maybe it was Cleavon. Maybe it was. I can't imagine who else it might have been.
Well,
Richard Pryor, or I don't know who it might have been. Cleavon is who I would have cast. I think Cleavon Little would have been able to play it, because you need him to. I don't know, you need him to be able to be convincing as somebody who would be the star of a Western television show.
Yeah.
And I think obviously Cleavon could do that. But I almost think that this could have been made into a movie, or these two books could have been condensed down into one movie. I think it could have happened.
Right.
If Russ Meyer can make a blaxploitation movie, which he did, then Ed Wood certainly could have made one. Although by the 60s, I guess somebody else probably would have been directing at that point. It probably would have gone to somebody else. It probably would have gone to,
right.
I don't know,
You make a good point though, because blaxploitation does not really become
a
popular
thing until the
for
70s.
until a few years later. So he's a bit ahead of his time. And of course,
Yeah.
he revisits sort of the Black Power organization and some similar themes, and it's a book that I like very much, but has exactly the opposite ending, a very tragic ending.
Okay.
It's Tony Black Empress, but that's definitely worth checking out. That is more in the freewheeling sort of let it rip. Perhaps I agree with you. Perhaps he's very inebriated when he's writing it. More so like what's the difference? And then he gets into race at the time in a couple of other paperbacks as well. Funnily enough, race, although it's the backdrop for Watts After, it's not dwelt upon necessarily. In particular, what I mean is
No.
Rocky thinks a lot in Watts the Difference about his own race and about what it means to be black and why it's a bad thing. That never comes up in Watts After.
Nope.
And although at some point later in the book, Angie and Rocky are sensitive to the notion, if we have a kid together, do we realize what that means? And I think they say, quote unquote, means black and white. And they just immediately accept it. There's not a lot of conflict around the racial angle
No.
in the book at all.
And in fact, someone says in the book, until whites and blacks get together, nothing's going to be solved. So
Yeah.
um, some people will react to this book. They'll just, especially the first one, and they'll see the use of the N word through both books and the negative depiction of the Black Power movement. And they'll just come to the immediate conclusion, oh, Ed was a racist. These are
Right.
racist books. And I think Ed had a lot of racial hangups, but there is some optimism there. And certainly the most sympathetic and strong character in either of these books is Rocky in both of them. And I said, I think in the last one, that these books start this duology, if we can call it that, started with an interracial friendship and ends with an interracial marriage. So
Yeah.
those are the bookending events of this. So I think that Ed was very, very suspicious of the Black Power movement. I don't know that he was necessarily anti, let's say, Martin Luther King, but he would have been anti Malcolm X, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So for Ed, this book is progressive. I would say this book, by Ed's
Right.
standards,
I think so too.
standards, this is a progressive book. So don't the really ugly racial stuff. If that really is bothersome to readers and really triggering to readers, just skip the first book entirely. It's
right.
It's much less in this book. The only, there's a point when Rocky starts looking up at the night sky, and he talks about the black sky with a couple of twinkling lights. And I thought, oh, this is going to turn into some sort of metaphor for being black. Although there is one passage about that kind of went over my head about you write black words on white paper. Maybe it's because it's easier to read than white words on black paper. And we were talking, I forgot who says that and under what circumstances, but
No, I took that the same way as well. I thought, is he going to get into some sort of a more complicated racial metaphor at this point? And it really didn't play itself out. It was just very sort of straightforward contrast between black and white without any definition of what that meant culturally beyond that. So yeah, race doesn't necessarily. You're right. Stay away from what's the difference if you
if
don't
that
want
really is bothersome to
if
you.
it's bothersome. And I can understand. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
Who actually was talking about the white words on black paper?
I'm
and the
trying to
black
think
words?
of who it was.
It was somewhere near the end of the book, I think. It had something to do with the prepared speech, maybe, that he was supposed to read. But because he's given a stack of papers toward the end that he tears up and he throws away.
I think it's Rocky in my
Could be
recollection.
Rocky.
I think it's Rocky.
But what it reminded me of was there was a documentary on television that aired in like the 80s or 90s in Detroit that was called White Words on Black Paper. No, Black Words on White Paper, and it was about black authors. And it was like it aired in February as sort of a Black History Month kind of special. And my father taught history in basically an all-Black high school. And for a Black History Month display outside of his room, he put up pictures of Black authors, and he titled it, I think, Black Words on White Paper, like the documentary had been called. But he had to take that down. He was told, oh, he had to take it down because I don't think any kids complained, but I think like the administration complained because that they found that the phrase Black words on white paper to be offensive. I guess because it likens black skin to ink. I don't know, because I don't know why that would be offensive, but I think he had to change the wording on that. But that's what I was thinking of when there was this rather meandering bit of dialogue about why black words on white paper are easier to read than white words on black paper. But I don't know that Ed had quite the grip on all these issues, because I think he writes in a frenzy. I think he writes in a very passionate stage. So,
Sure.
And I'm positive this is first draft that we're reading. So
Agreed. I mean, you could see, I believe, again, I assume that you're working off of an electronic copy from the Ramble House editions that are no longer in print or no longer publicly available. Myself as well, I don't have a physical copy of the book, but my understanding is that Ramble House did try to recreate the books identical to the actual text. They didn't try to correct punctuation and grammar errors, and that's obvious. You see punctuation and grammar errors. There are a couple moments where actually half sentences are repeated and things of that nature.
That.
So it's a first draft. I agree wholeheartedly.
Although the first book was way worse. There are some passages in What's the Difference that I had difficulty parsing because they were so full of typos. It's not that What's After is free from typos, but the first one was so bad that there was parts where I couldn't understand what he was talking about. And that's lessened in this one. So again, this is the accessible. This is on Ed Wood on the accessible side. So I went back and forth on if I were publishing these, would I keep in all the typos or would I correct some of them? I don't know. I guess to say true to it, I guess I would keep them in, but I would debate about it in my mind, because
you could do both. Obviously, you could do both. Just annotate it, right?
Yeah, with you could have footnotes all through the book saying like it was this way originally,
right.
But I think for readability's sake, I would have been sorely tempted to fix up some of the little things, like if there's not a period at the end of a sentence or something. I mean, I would have been tempted to fix that kind of stuff up. Or if it would say, some of the people think that, that would be typical of the kind of mistake that Ed would make, where he would write some of the twice. I don't know, is it 100% necessary to history to include that? I don't know. But it gives you, I guess it gives you some, well, I've seen some of Ed's manuscripts. I mean, I've seen Xerox copies of some of his screenplays, and they're kind of messy. So
yes, indeed. Indeed. So, more to come on that in a future Ed Wood Summit podcast. I think the books themselves, of course, if that's the original version in which they were published, it's nice to have that from a historical standpoint. Does it substantially change the readability of the book? Not really. Does it really matter, so to speak, I guess, in today's world? And more importantly, both of these books, What's the Difference and What's After, are not books that are come up on auction very often. I know a few people in the realm of Ed Woodology that have copies of them, but there are not a ton, as far as I'm aware of, a ton of copies of original copies of these two books floating around at all.
No. So I wish they were I wish they were more in circulation, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think you would get cease and desist, right away from distributing them. I don't know if there's been any any friction or blowback from just publishing the text for free online or just putting it up somewhere. There probably would be. Um, so if anybody ever anonymously posts the text of these books online, it wasn't me. I didn't do it at all. If I put it up at if someone puts it up, it wasn't me. Um,
Nor me, nor me. I agree, Joe. I'm glad you said that because I have access to much of this material, as do you, and many people don't, and I'm sure they're clamoring for it. It would be great to. It's so great to have Angora fever, to have
yeah,
blood splatters quickly. But additional to that, I think the nebulous area of copyright around Ed's work is still very much
yeah,
unresolved, and I'm not going there myself
no,
personally.
but
That's not. I have
I
no
don't.
reason to, right?
Well, it's why I'm always every time any kind of movie or story or article or anything comes up, I'm always halfway hesitant to review it because um, there are people who I know will report it, and people who are monitoring that kind of thing, and so there is a short movie that I'm planning on writing an article about in the near future. Just to be safe, I saved it to my hard drive. So if if it gets if it gets to be in trouble, if there gets to be trouble where it's taken down offline, um, I don't understand that. I mean, Ed's been dead 43 years now, I think.
Hmm.
All the producers are dead. All the publishing companies are basically the producers are dead. The companies that he worked for are long since closed.
Right.
Um, so I would just say I just want all this stuff out there.
Me too, ultimately. But I'm sensitive, I
But
guess, to the
yeah,
fact that there are those who feel that they might have some r- reasonable rights claim.
right. And uh, so to me, every time a new movie or new anything turns up, that's always a wonderful thing, but it's not universally considered so. And some people will, if they don't like this, if they don't like it, that a thing has been released without permission, they'll boycott it or they'll try to get it taken down. I don't, I don't feel any ownership over Ed. So um,
Right.
I think Ed himself would probably, I don't know. I wouldn't want to speak for Ed, but maybe Ed would just want the stuff out there.
I can
Um,
only imagine he would at this point, right? Being that he's long since passed, would he enjoy the
I think
notion
he
of
would.
his work being made publicly available, right? Of course he would.
Yeah,
As an artist, how could he not, right?
right. So
Yeah.
I, my personal feeling is just put the stuff out there and let the chips fall where they may. I understand that that is not a universally held viewpoint, and I sympathize with the people who don't agree with that. And I understand their reasons because they said if you put stuff out for free, that kind of prevents legitimate releases from happening. I am very glad that we have Blood Splatters Quickly and Angora Fever. Um, but personally, okay, here's the thing. I would have reprinted those stories like exactly as they appeared in the magazines. I would have
Right.
like reprinted just like the layouts, the artwork, everything about them, so that when you're flipping through the book, it's just like flipping through those old pages.
Oh yeah, right to the layout of the actual magazine page would have been
Exactly.
ideal, right?
I would have recreated those things right down to the artwork and the layout and just the columns and everything. But I understand why that is not a universally held viewpoint. So um, it's a debate, I guess, it's an ongoing debate within the Ed Wood universe, whether this stuff should be out or shouldn't. Um, but yeah, maybe this video will cause somebody to go out there and seek out a copy of these books. Maybe
That would be
that'd be cool.
ideal for those of you
So
who find this interesting, right? If you find this interesting, yeah, keep your eyes open. Again,
yeah,
you're going to have actually a little bit of a hard time trying to track down copies, actual physical original copies of
copies,
What's the
but
Difference or What's After in today's world. Interesting thing. we've gone on quite
Yeah.
at length at this point, so I'm actually not concerned about trying to wrap things up. Since if you're still with us, you're obviously somebody who's fascinated by this and quite interested in this. I wonder sometimes, Ed Wood's paperbacks, the market for them seems to actually be contracting in the last couple of years. I'm going strictly on anecdotal evidence based on watching eBay auctions and watching Amazon pricing. What I mean by this is, I'll use a simple example. I won't cite the book nor the individual, but a gentleman told me just a week or two ago that he had paid less than $100 for a title that is so rare that I've never seen it come up on eBay in the last 5 years of my life. And he paid something like the first time that it came up, he paid something like $80 for it. Now that's a very different world
Right.
than 5 years ago, and you will still see books with very, very high price tags on them on occasion. But 5 years ago, I remember a gentleman telling me uh, one of Ed's paperbacks had come up on an eBay auction, and he had never seen it go up on auction previously. So he immediately made the person an offer of $1,000 because he knew that it was going to immediately go through the roof if there was bidding on it. There would be so many people who were hungry for it. And I don't think that's the case in today's world. Even with the Pendulum magazines, I see them sometimes turning up on eBay, and you can get them 3 or 4 years ago. You might pay $50, $70 for a Pendulum magazine. You can get them now more in the range with an Edge story in them, maybe in the range of $30 or something like that. So I think the market has actually sort of shrunk in terms of price point around original Ed works, and then I'm sure it'll continue to morph and change over time.
Here's the thing. People will find this hard to believe, but I'll repeat it from something that I said in the very first Summit podcast. I am not a collector of the physical objects at all.
Right.
Very, I have the two ridiculous things I have. I have the Glen or Glenda poster that you've seen in previous videos, and I have some Plan 9 lobby cards. But when it comes to getting physical copies of the books, they're nice to have. But here's the thing that affects my collecting of anything in any field, including Ed Wood. I don't want the things because they're old or because they're valuable or because they're rare. I want them because I want the actual thing. I want the actual book. And to me, a reprint of any of these is absolutely as good, because,
Right.
and probably even better, because a paperback from 1966, I mean, I would have to be very, very delicate with it,
It'll crumble in your
and it
hands.
will
Yep.
crumble, and I'd have to keep it in a plastic bag, and that wouldn't be any fun to me
Right.
at all. So like even the Glen or Glenda poster, I have it in a windowless room under with no lights, you know, and it's under a UV protective frame or whatever.
Yeah.
It looks exactly the way it did when I bought it a few years ago.
Yeah.
But I can't say that it like brings me a great deal of joy. And the Plan 9 lobby cards, I just keep in plastic in a big folder, and I look at them maybe twice a year. So
Right.
because I think if I took them out and put them up on the wall, they would disintegrate, because they're just, you know, this
Yeah.
very thin pieces of paper. So yeah, you know, I don't have any interest in owning the I'm glad that Bob goes on eBay and buys up all those old magazines
Yeah.
to reprint the stories. um, I don't really, I mean, I guess it would be sort of nice to own I guess it would be sort of nice to own the magazines or the books, the old copies. But well, I guess another one of the rare, not rare, but one of the only vintage things I have, the only vintage publication I have, is the Ed Wood's Tom of Finland thing, because
Hey,
those were, for some reason,
circus. Yeah.
circus, Pekka at the circus, those things are super cheap for some reason. I guess there was like a bunch of them somewhere.
I think
Um,
maybe you grabbed it after I found it on eBay,
yeah,
and there was like
the,
10 copies available at like
oh,
$10 a piece. I bought two
geez.
copies myself. Yeah.
And That one is nice to have
Yeah,
because
it's unique.
it's unique. It
Right.
says Ed's name right on it,
Yep.
and it's connected to Tom of Finland, who is a famous artist,
Right.
and maybe a reprint of just the story, because one of the Ramble House collections actually has the text of
I think
that.
Shortwood. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can, if you just want the text, um, but you can get a little bit more of the feel of it to get, when you see Tom of Finland's artwork with
Oh,
it.
sure. Something like that. By that point, Ed was commonly writing what I call pictorial texts, right? He's
Yeah,
taking a photo feature and he's writing a text to fit around it. And that's clearly what he's doing with the Pekka story. He's writing a story that fits the illustrations. Because if you look at Tom of Finland's original Pekka story, it has its own narrative, actually,
right.
separate and apart from the illustrations. But yeah, I don't do it either, Joe. I don't collect a whole ton of the physical stuff. So people send me things, like I said, and I'm always grateful
I
for that.
I wish people would send me things, but they don't. Um,
Send Joe
send me
send
stuff,
him some Ed
and
Wood stuff.
but I mean it's the same. To bring up Happy Days, I co-host a Happy Days podcast, and what's today? Tuesday? Is today Tuesday?
Today's
Yeah, today's
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Yep.
So we just had an episode come out today, and there's tons of Happy Days merchandise and stuff. I have very, very little of it. Um, Not because I don't want it, but because it's expensive. And I was kind of hoping by this point that people would just be sending me Happy Days stuff in the mail or something, but
Yeah.
it hasn't happened. Um, but I don't know. It's kind of nice occasionally to have the physical things, but I don't have the room for it, and I really don't have the money for it. So um, I'm very, very happy with. I'm very, very happy with the reprints, and
Yeah.
so I wish that I guess the Ramble House things are never coming back. Uh,
No.
I've not seen too many of the paper ones of the Ramble House ones. I mean,
There was very few, to my
very, very few.
understanding. Yeah, there
So,
was not a whole lot of copies. Yeah.
so if you can find it, if you can find these books online somewhere, I would say,
Yeah. Luckily, it was my birthday a couple of weeks ago, and I told my significant other, I said, there's an auction going right now, and it was actually where Joe and I are both members of a private Ed Wood Facebook group, and it's quite an active group with a lot of good information on it. And somebody had mentioned that Security Risk, a I think 66 or 67 Ed Wood paperback, also published by Pad Library, just like the Watts books, was up on eBay for something like $80 or something like that. So I said to her, hey, you want to go take a crack at it? Now, and it had make an offer. So that's the key word, because what I know is Kitten, my significant other. She's really good at making offers and getting people to bend in her direction. So I think she got me a copy of Security Risk, and it's in really nice condition. It's a little yellowed, obviously, and the spine is a little bit dry. To your point, would I actually read that copy of it? No, I'll read the electronic copy I have, but it's nice to
yeah,
have the physical copy. But she got it for only $55. She was able to pull that person down to 55. That's a fairly low price in terms of going price for an actual Ed Wood paperback. And that
right.
one also, just like the Watts books, is credited to Ed Wood. I think it's Ed D. Wood Jr. or Ed D. Wood, just like he's credited on both of the Watts books.
I mean, I wouldn't turn them down
Right.
as things. I mean, um, I don't have any way to play them, but I would like some of like the loops or something. That would be kind of cool to have some of
Yeah,
that. That might be a little bit cool to have. Um, that 8mm version of Plan 9 would be a kind of a neat,
it would. Right.
would be a
Yeah.
neat little thing to have. Um, I kind of gave up because when I wanted just for a minimal thing to get one of those Don Post um, masks of Tor Johnson. I wanted to get a Don Post Tor Johnson mask, and I soon found myself a little out of my depth on eBay. It's like it was getting a little. It was getting a little too spicy for my taste, so I had to
Sure.
back off on that one. I was like, those have got to be, there's got to be hundreds of them lying around in a warehouse or something somewhere. Those got to be cheap, but they are not. And so that one that one may have broken me. The Don Post. I was so happy then when I got just the Ed Wood Players card set for cheap.
The Friedman
the Drew
set.
Friedman thing.
Right.
Because those sometimes can be expensive. I don't know if they're
Yeah,
expensive.
I don't have that. I don't have that.
So I mean,
Yeah.
I just happened to be a used one on Amazon, I think, for very cheap, and so I just picked that one up. So it helps though to there's some stuff that you can get for cheap, and I'll tell you an example. I was just reading last night the Western Hall of Fame book, the book about the Cowboy Hall of Fame. Now Ed didn't write that, but we know that Ed owned a copy of it because he poses with his personal copy of the Western Hall of Fame. I might be getting the title wrong, but it's something like the Cowboy Hall of Fame or the Western Hall of Fame.
I think it's Western Hall of Fame, yeah.
Western Hall of Fame. And I found it to be in its own way a useful reference book. And my copy was, I think, a library copy. So you could see that it had been checked out of the library. You can tell the markings of
I bought a copy of that 3 or 4 years ago, and I got it for, I think, a decent price, like $10 or so. Old hardcover. My copy's in decent shape. The slip cover's a little bit scuffed, but
I'm missing my slip cover. So they knocked some dollars off the price for it.
So for the benefit of the audience, so Ed is holding a copy of this book in a photograph when it's Kenny Duncan's memorial service, which happened at Ed Wood's house. So he and Kathy are kneeling on the ground, and then behind them in the photograph, a number of their friends and Kenny's friends, including Kenny's girlfriend Nona Carver, and I think Hope Leininger was there, and a few other people. But yeah, Ed's holding that book. So the book itself, it is a useful reference resource for old Westerns. Yeah. But the funny thing about it is he's holding it up in a picture at Kenny Duncan's memorial service. There's this much. Yes. This much. There's 3 sentences, if that, mentioning Kenny Duncan in the whole entire book. Yeah.
And Kenny, you have to really search for it because Kenny's name doesn't even turn up in the index. I don't think. But as luck would have it, Tom Keene gets written about a whole bunch in the book. So there's a generous portion about Tom. And I think pretty soon I'm going to have to write something about Tom Keene.
Yeah.
In my attempt to understand, I didn't understand Tom Keene. I was like, why was Tom Keene ever a thing? Like, why is this guy in movies? Like, what is this guy's appeal? What is so special about this guy?
Right.
And I think the Western Hall of Fame helped me understand Tom Keene a little bit better because I first only knew him from the Ed Wood movies. And why is Ed Wood using this guy over and over again, Tom Keene? And now I've read a little bit about Tom Keene, and I've started to find Tom's other films, of which there are so many. Tom just was cranking out these movies left and right, and trying to understand Tom a little bit better. And so the book was helpful in doing that. And then there was this guy, the guy that wrote the book about Lugosi that came to Ed's apartment and got drunk, and then they
Richard Bojarski.
And Richard's book is a very nice reference book. It's a very useful little book, very, very cheap. And Ed Wood did contribute to that book because Ed was one of the interview subjects. So I'll buy that kind of stuff. If I can get it for like $5 or $10, yeah, sure, why not?
Well, frankly, Joe, in my mind, as you get deeper into this, very well, as well as I, there's so much stuff out there. And it seems like the deeper you dig, you can actually unearth things that have never even previously really been floating around. And so I'm always excited. I'm always really excited. This whole pursuit of Ed's life and work. Again, I'm not sure exactly why I'm so obsessive about it, but it is largely in the pursuit. And yes, can I respect him as an outsider artist? I do,
Yeah.
you know, quite a great deal. I do think we've gone on now for
We
quite at
have
length, and we're getting a little far afield from perhaps the original
from
subject matter from Watts After.
Watts After.
So
This is after Watts
after
After.
Watts After, but just super quick, let's try to wrap it up. Final words on Watts After? Anything you'd like to say?
I think Watts After is both an amazing a snapshot of a turbulent time in American history and a great catalog of Ed Wood's obsessions and quirks. So I think it works on both of those levels.
I'll leave it at that because I think that was perfectly stated. The only additional thing I'll say to that is I find the character of Angie really attractive. All of that angora that she wears, and she's just I would love to see the character of Angie turn up, or a avatar of Angie's character in other
Yeah,
works of Ed's, which I'm sure it's out there. She's based on somebody or something, right?
right.
She's not just built out of whole cloth, which is
Well, she's
probably the wrong thing to
blonde.
say. Yeah,
She's blonde, so
like Kathy, right?
like Kathy. So Ed loved his blondes,
Yep.
And I think,
Dolores, right?
yeah, Dolores Fuller and then Kathy. I think he describes her breasts so often that you could probably draw them from memory after reading the book. So yeah, Angie does seem like pretty hot stuff. Although, you know, I thought, you know, I was trying to picture, I don't know why, but even though she's blonde, I kept picturing her as Anne Margaret, but I couldn't.
Interesting. I didn't really get a actual person in my head. I didn't quite think it through to that
I
point,
don't know,
but
when I'm reading a book, I tend to
yeah.
make the characters into actors. And so Angie became Anne Margaret, Rocky became Cleavon Little, and Swahili became Jimmy J.J. Walker for me. So,
Wow, interesting. J.J. Walker.
because tall and thin and with froggy eyes. So I was
Yeah,
like,
froggy eyes. He does mention that numerous times. He has frog-like eyes. Um, that would leave who would play Rance Holiday?
Ed.
Ed would play Rance Holiday.
Ed would
Right.
play, or Bunny Breckenridge or something. I don't know. Maybe Bunny would play him.
Right.
Bring Bunny back to the screen.
All right. Well, cool. Thank you, Joe. This has been really great. Of course, everybody, I hope you guys not only enjoyed what we had to say about Watts After, but subsequently we went a little deeper into some other tangential Ed Wood related items. And we can't help ourselves, or at least I'll speak for myself.
Yeah, it just
It
flows
just
once you start
exactly,
talking.
exactly. So, so we'll be back. Joe and myself will be back with more book reviews at some point in the relatively near future. I'll be back here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast at some point in the relatively near future. I want to say thank you to everybody for not only your patience in slogging through all this. I hope you found it enjoyable, but also your patience. If you've heard my dogs barking in the background, if they were annoying or disruptive at all, I apologize for that. There, she barked on cue as I said that, as a matter of fact. But we appreciate it, and we will definitely be back at some point soon. And I hope, and I'm sure Joe feels the same way, we hope you guys found this enjoyable and found it of some benefit in your appreciation of Ed Wood. Thank you.
All right. Bye.